Hello everybody, how's everybody doing? It's Ellie here for WhoCulture, and I feel like we should all give ourselves a pat on the back, a round of applause, because we made it. We made it through Doctor Who's 60th anniversary, and now we can all sleep. Haha, who can sleep? We got a Christmas special next week. And while we have done some extensive discussions and breakdowns of each individual episode, we thought that now that we've had a time to sit with those episodes for a little while, to watch them again, to really think about what we liked and disliked about the whole anniversary, we thought that we'd do an overall ups and downs for the 60th anniversary of Doctor Who. So we started with the Star Beast, which feels like such a long time ago now. I'm going to give this overall episode an up. I think that it really brought that nostalgia, built up the excitement, and delivered on all the fronts that make Doctor Who what it is. I loved the story of the episode, I loved the characters of the episode, and just in general, it really gave me a warm feeling inside. Having said that, within that episode, I do have a down. I did talk about this in the ups and downs for that episode itself, but even now I still feel like it just was so unnecessary, and that was the opening recap that we had at the beginning of that episode. I just don't feel as though we needed a 5-minute recap of Series 4. It felt a little bit overkill. I don't really understand why David Tennant was kind of floating in space, and also there was this kind of gap, this empty space next to him that had, it had some sort of weird orangey glow, but I thought something was going to appear in that space, and it didn't, and it just felt a little bit off kilter. And funnily enough, even Rachel Talalay, the director of The Star Beast, was quick to confirm and let everybody know that she actually was not responsible for that recap, and she wanted everybody to be aware. That had nothing to do with her. You know, when the Toymaker appears in the Giggle, we don't get a 5-minute recap of the Toymaker. We get a few glimpses of, like, flashbacks, and that's all we need to know that this is relevant. But this just felt like a little bit too much of overkill. We know. We know. And for those viewers who are new to Doctor Who and did need a little refresh, it could have just been a dramatic previously on Doctor Who, and we could have moved on quite quickly. Even now, it still doesn't sit right with me. Speaking of things that don't sit right and feel a little bit off, I'm sorry we have got another down. I love the opening title sequence, and that's brilliant. I love it. All the way up until the logo flies in, and it feels a little bit PowerPoint presentation animation to me. And when we've got this big budget for Doctor Who now, and so many wonderful visuals and effects within the show itself, it just felt a little bit like, had this been left to the last minute, or had they literally done it on PowerPoint? It just, compared to the higher stakes of everything else and the attention to detail and just higher standards of everything else, this just feels a little bit off. And I can't even put my finger on what it is. It just feels a little amateur, dare I say. I'm so sorry to whoever designed that. Okay, but let's now move on to some ups. So one of the big ups for the 60th anniversary as a whole, but something we really started to see immediately in the Star Beast was this attention to nostalgia, particularly towards Series 4. If you're a new viewer, maybe it was a little bit too much nostalgia driven, and again, if you're a new viewer, you needed that recap, but these episodes were very much, especially the Star Beast, were aimed at viewers who understood the relationship between the Doctor and Donna and the relevance and importance of what it meant for them to be seeing each other again. As someone who was a child watching Series 4 and now watching this as an adult, it's perfect. I find it very hard to find the words for it, but there was just this warm fuzzy feeling inside that just made me feel like I was 10 years old again, and I think they did it on purpose. They brought these characters back for a reason. And I can never remember who they use as an example, but I think, is it Justin Bieber? And stick with me here, because I realise I have just said Justin Bieber here on WhoCulture. Is it he who released music when a group of fans were a younger age, and he released music that was very much appealing to that age group, and then years later released a different style of music that still appealed to that same age group, and he evolved with that group of people. And so once they became adults, he made his music more fitting for them at their current age. I feel like that's a little bit of what happened here. They were aware that viewers of Series 4 as children would now be adults, and so they were kind of appealing to those same viewers. Am I stretching? I don't know. But I think it speaks for itself with how much nostalgia there was just in this first episode alone. And on that note, let's go to another up for the overall 60th, and again, something we started to see quite quickly just in this first episode. Something that I particularly find within the nostalgia of Doctor Who is the use of practical effects. And I have mentioned this in some of our discussions, in some of my ups and downs, in a lot of what we've spoken about in the last few weeks. I really like the practical effects that they use in Doctor Who. I don't like it when they go too overboard with the CGI. I mean, when in 2005, the CGI would look slightly dodgy and iffy. And now I feel like if you use it too much, it takes away from what Doctor Who is, because Doctor Who is about practical props, and sometimes it looks hokey, but that's okay with me. And what I really like is that they did use CGI, but CGI and visual effects were kind of used more to enhance rather than to be the sole thing to be used to create these monsters and effects. So particularly the Meep. I honestly did not know that the Meep wasn't CGI until I watched the episode of Unleashed afterwards, which you'll be able to tell because when I did the ups and downs, I hadn't watched the episode of Unleashed yet, and I started talking about CGI and then realised afterwards that Meep was so much more practical than I ever noticed. They've achieved something really, really impressive, and 90% of it was done practically, and I think that's amazing. And that's the same for all of the episodes. While Blue Yonder, we had the long arms, that was a practical effect. And plenty of things that we also saw in the Giggle as well were all practical. You know, the puppets and things could have very easily been made using green screen or visually, or on a computer, and actually they used puppets. And I think that was so impressive. But while we are on the topic of things being overused or heavily relied on, such as CGI, I do have another down, the Sonic. Now, I've already given my opinions on the Sonic screwdriver, as in my thoughts on its enhancements and suddenly being able to form shields and things, but that's not where my down comes here. My down comes here, regardless on your thoughts and opinions on its enhancements and what it suddenly is capable of doing. I feel like the balance of the use of the Sonic wasn't quite right across the three specials. You know, in the first episode, in the Star Beast, they very much emphasised its upgrades, and it was used, you know, to literally build shields so they could avoid bullets. And it was heavily relied upon within that episode. But then when you go into Wild Blue Yonder, it's literally not there. It disappears with the TARDIS, and I don't recall it being used very much in the Giggle either. And as much as I personally wasn't a massive fan of the super duper upgrades, I do feel like what was the point, A, in even having a new sonic screwdriver, but B, making such a big deal out of this brand new supersonic for it to only be used in one of the 3 episodes with any real need, and actually is now going to not exist anymore. It does exist, but when we move into Ncuti Gatwa's new season, he will have a new screwdriver, which we've already seen advertised and shown. It just felt like a lot of hype over something that we didn't actually see that much. But while we're on the topic of things feeling a bit null and void, I do have another down. There were certain things that in the build-up to these anniversary specials, we really wanted to know the answers to. One of those things was an explanation as to why this particular face had returned. I know that we had an explanation, kind of not in universe, but from Russell T Davies about why the Doctor's clothes regenerated with him, but we kind of thought we may have some sort of in-universe explanation for that. And also, such a big deal was made about the Dr. Donna and the whole meta-crisis situation and her dying if she ever remembered. And all 3 of those things felt a little bit irrelevant, actually. I mean, the Dr. Donna part was relevant to the Star Beast, but the solution to that problem was dealt with quite quickly, and as soon as it was dealt with, it kind of was forgotten about, and they made such a big deal about it in the build-up, and even in series 4, you know, she cannot remember me, she will die. They repeated it about 3 times just in that opening recap. Yes, she did die for all of about 2 seconds, but then the resolution came, and we had 2 more episodes where it was kind of never really mentioned or talked about again. It just felt a little bit kind of null and void after the solution came in the first episode. And likewise, as I said, we do get an explanation for why that particular face came back, but I think everybody expected it to be a much bigger explanation. You know, I think a lot of people assumed that it would be something to do with the toy maker's influence, and the explanation that we did get just felt a little bit underwhelming. I think because everybody had speculated so much in their head, which I know is often the problem. It's not actually a problem with what the writers have done, and more a case of people speculating so much that then they overhype themselves. But yeah, in my mind, that was just a little bit null and void and a little bit overhyped, and then not really getting the payoff that we thought we would. Having said that, an up here. Let's go back to some positives. Something that absolutely did pay off was the return of David Tennant and Catherine Tate. The performances across all 3 specials from everyone were amazing. There wasn't a single bad performance across the board. The return of David Tennant and Catherine Tate, still at their strongest. Catherine Tate, I feel like, I've mentioned this before, Doctor Who is the platform for her to really showcase her range of acting abilities, and she's just as brilliant as she always was. And I would like to give a special up to the performance from Jacqueline King. Because of the way her character treated Donna in Series 4, she was a very unlikable character in a lot of ways. And there seems to be a little bit of a redemption story here for her, the way that she cares for Donna, just the nuances in her performance, the way you can see how much she cares and worries, and I just think her performance was standout. I mean, amongst a whole episode of standout performances, but Jacqueline King really kind of stole the scenes that she was in a really subtle and nuanced way. So I didn't want to let her slide by without getting a little notice there. So then the next episode that we had was Blue Yonder. Again, I'm going to give this episode overall an up. I will be honest that it was an episode that I needed to watch a second time to fully comprehend, fully understand. And if I perhaps had only watched it that one time, then it might have got a down. It's one of those episodes that just requires a little bit more thought, and not necessarily because it's complicated, but just because it's so different. There is a down for the episode in as much as it was really hyped by the creatives and Russell T Davies. It was shrouded in mystery. You know, they made a very big point of saying that they wanted people to go into this episode without having seen anything from it. They omitted pretty much most of it from any of the trailers, and they really emphasized how mysterious they wanted this episode to be. And so naturally, everybody started to hypothesize as to what was going to happen in this story. And because it was so mysterious and shrouded in secrecy, everyone assumed that it was going to contain something really shocking. Of course, everyone speculates it's an anniversary special, that we're going to have cameos, we're going to see characters from the past, or something really spoilery is going to happen, which is why they shrouded it in so much mystery. And again, as I mentioned, a lot of that is maybe on the viewers, is the fault of the viewers for over speculating. But I think in this instance, the creatives didn't help by putting so much emphasis on the mystery about this episode. And so I think that maybe hurt the initial response from viewers, because everybody was expecting something really shocking to happen, and it didn't. And it wasn't an awful episode, and I think that's what harmed it. If you've just gone into it knowing it was going to be a kind of a wacky episode, then that probably would have made people leave watching that episode thinking, that was really different, and I'm not sure what I think, but I really enjoyed it, as opposed to going, well, why was it such a mystery? Having said that, another up, and I did start to touch on that just a second ago, it's such a different episode. And that's to be said for all 3 of the episodes are vastly different and a little bit experimental. For example, While Blue Yonder is a kind of experimental episode. You've only got two actors carrying the entire thing. And yes, you've got more characters, but you had 2 actors playing 4 different characters. So that in itself was really impressive, on the parts of the actors, on the trust of the creative team. I think I've mentioned this in some of our videos, you know, you need to experiment and explore new things in order to keep the show fresh and keep people entertained and interested. That was definitely really great to see. You know, you had the more generic Doctor Who nostalgia-based episode with the Starbeast. You had the more experimental, wacky, verging on kind of horror of While Blue Yonder, and then moving into the Giggle, you had the more epic, showstoppery wow factor that we saw in the Giggle, you know, complete with pretty much a musical number. That was a very big up for these 3 specials, is how wildly different they all were. And speaking of difference, another major up that we particularly started to notice in Blue Yonder and then saw grow even more in the Giggle is the growth we see between 10 and 14. You know, you hear that David Tennant's returning, and then you learn that David Tennant's returning, but he's coming as the 14th Doctor, not the 10th. And so you've got to find a good balance between, you don't want David Tennant to return and then play the Doctor in a completely unrecognisable and different way to what you know him for, because why would you bother bringing him back if you're going to have him play it completely differently? But at the same time, the acknowledgement that this is not 10, this is a Doctor who has experienced all of the things that 11 has, and 12 has, and 13 has, and we're now at a point where we have 14. And yes, he has the face of 10, but he has all of the experiences and losses and pains and heartache of the other 3 incarnations that have come between. And I think David Tennant did a really, really good job of playing that subtle change in the character. And sometimes it wasn't subtle. We saw moments, especially in Blue Yonder, that really challenged him and brought those thoughts and feelings to his mind, and we saw that emotional release from him. And that's something that we didn't see in 10. Perhaps towards the end he started to let out his anger a little bit more, but this is a Doctor who is much more emotional, much more open with his emotions, and isn't afraid to express them, which is something that he's picked up from 11, 12 and 13. And following on from that, another up, and I know this is maybe a very divisive thought to have, but I personally like the idea that the Timeless Child and the Flux were acknowledged. I know a lot of people were hoping that it would just be completely retconned and disregarded. Personally, I don't think that's the right way to go. I don't think it's right to just completely undo someone else's work. I completely agree that they maybe don't want to take it too far forward, but the acknowledgement of it, the acknowledgement of how that has affected the Doctor, which I think is the most powerful and important part of it here. And I think that's a really clever way of them incorporating it into this new story and moving forward. They're not really going to touch on what it means, who other incarnations were, or dive into it too much in that form. So they focused on the effect that it had emotionally on the Doctor. And I think that was a really, really good way of making sure that it was still acknowledged, and now it can be, and now we can move on. And of course, I think the greatest up for Blue Yonder, for pretty much everybody watching, was seeing Wilf in those closing moments. Now, we did learn later on that they very well could have killed off the character of Wilf because Bernard Cribbins wasn't able to film anymore for the episode. He'd only managed to film that one scene that we did see, and there was discussions of just saying that the character had died, and not including that footage. I am so glad and grateful that they decided against that and still included that scene with Wilf. I don't think that it harmed the following episode. I mean, the use of the body double, it was enough to know that Wilf was safe, and I think there's something just so Doctor Who about the fact that this loved character can just remain and live on within the Whoniverse, and we can just imagine what Wilf is up to. I definitely think it was the right decision not to kill off the character, and I really loved that touching scene. I mean, it brought so many tears seeing Bernard Cribbins, and what a legacy to have Doctor Who as his final acting role before his passing. Absolutely 100% up for making sure that Wilf was still included despite not getting everything you needed from Bernard Cribbins in filming. So then, as I mentioned, Wilf was then included in the beginning of The Giggle. The Giggle was my favourite of the 3 specials. I think maybe it was the favourite for a lot of people. It was fun, it was epic, everything about it was funny. I loved the episode, and I found it quite difficult to think of many downs for the episode. So of course, The Giggle in itself gets an up, and the first up for this episode was Neil Patrick Harris. Neil Patrick Harris as the Toymaker is perfect casting. I feel like he was born to play that role. He was absolutely fabulous. There's just this showman. He's a character you love to hate, and that is credit to how he's portrayed. I can't think of anything about the character I didn't like. He was just absolutely wonderful. And again, another up, spice up your life. Only Doctor Who could have a lip sync scene to spice up your life and it be just as terrifying as it is enjoyable. Just the contrasts of what was happening. You know, it was so showy and everyone's bopping to the song and enjoying themselves, but at the same time you've got Kate Stewart being smacked into a wall, you've got Mel crashing to the floor, you've got soldiers being turned into bouncy balls and they're dead and their heads are trapped inside these balls. It's so dark and twisted, and yet you can't help but sit there smiling and laughing along. And I also think a lot of people have called for a musical episode or moment in Doctor Who. And while I absolutely relish the day that it happens, I also know that sometimes it is done and doesn't necessarily work, or people are not as big a fan of it. And this is a really good balance in the middle. You know, it wasn't a full-on everyone starts singing and dancing, but it was enough to go, we've got songs, we've got dancing, we've got this, but it's not forced upon. It absolutely works for the character, and this was the best episode for it. So, spice up your life, yes. And while we're on the topic of music, another whopping up across all 3 episodes, but especially something that I noticed straight from the beginning of the Giggle, Murray Gold is back. I love some of Sega Nakanola's music, don't get me wrong, but there's something about Murray Gold that just hits you somewhere and makes you feel so many things. Particularly the theme for the Toy Maker. I don't know what it is about that kind of choral music, but it was just perfect for the character, for the situation, and I've really enjoyed having Murray Gold back. I've loved having the musical callbacks. You know, some people don't really take much notice to the music, but the score to me is something very important. I absolutely love musical score. It's what my playlists are full of, and it was lovely to hear those motifs and callbacks to music from Series 4, from other series as well, and just have that familiarity in the music. Speaking of familiarity, another up for this episode is Unit's back, but Unit's back with a major upgrade. When I saw the kind of Stark Towers / Unit Towers in the trailers, I was a little bit like, oh dear, what's happened to Unit? I'm not sure if I'm going to like this. But I take it back. They've done a really good job of re-establishing Unit in a way that means we can see more characters returning without the need for the Doctor to explain something. I think having Unit as this big organisation now that's less secretive, it allows you to have those characters returning without needing the Doctor to bring them back or for them to have to be connected to the Doctor, because they could work for Unit. It sets up these... We know there are spin-offs coming, and I know there's been a lot of speculation that there will be a Unit spin-off. And while that may not be the case, I feel like they've set it up perfectly and it would absolutely make sense and work. Kate Stewart is a character who could hold a spin-off. I think it really opens up the opportunity for more companions and characters of the past to return, like I said, without the need for the Doctor. And Mel was a really good example of that. The offer of a job for Donna. Just in general, I think that Unit is a really, really great thread for Doctor Who to have. Having said that, do have another down, the Vlinks. Don't get me wrong, I'm slightly indifferent to the character of the Vlinks, but there is where the down comes, because for such a wonderful episode with so many wonderful things happening, the Vlinks felt just a little bit unnecessary. It just felt like it was put there for the sake of it. And I know that we've been teased that we will be seeing more of the Vlinks, and if that time comes, then maybe I'll take back this down, if we get a little bit more explanation. But it just felt like it was put there with no... You know, that could have easily not been there. That could have just been... Shirley could have said those lines. The only thing, it was kind of the Vlinks created the Z-Dex, but equally a scientist could have come up with the Z-Dex. It just felt a little bit... What's the point of the Vlinks other than to go, look, we've got a cool robot? Like I said, I might take that back if we learn loads more about the Vlinks later down the line. But for now, it just felt a little bit unnecessary, surrounded by all these wonderful characters. But let's go back to the positives of Unit, and another whopping up for everything that we've seen in these specials. But particularly, Unit is a really good example of it, is that we have maintained a really good balance of continuity between eras. When a new Doctor arrives, or maybe a new showrunner or something, there is a tendency to almost have a soft reboot of the show. You know, from 10 to 11, it worked well. You know, it was the end of 10, it was the end of Russell T Davis's first era, and we moved into Stephen Moffat and Matt Smith. And it did feel a little bit like a reboot, a soft reboot to the show, and it worked wonders. It was really, really well executed, and people and people responded to it in a positive way. Doesn't always work though, and I think a good example of that is when we changed from 12 to 13 and Stephen Moffat left and Chris Chibnall took over. They were very set on having this clean slate and trying to not follow too much on the continuity of what came before and try and move forward in a new direction where people could come in from here and not need to know anything of the past. And personally, I don't think that works because you're not starting a new show. And if you don't acknowledge and continue threads from what came before, you're isolating all of those fans who have been on that journey from the beginning. And I know you need to find a balance so you don't isolate new fans that are joining. The balance in that instance wasn't there, and you can see that they realised that when they then suddenly brought the character of Captain Jack back, for example, and they started to kind of backpedal and do so. Whereas here, I think the balance was absolutely perfect. You obviously had all the nostalgia and callbacks and the returning characters like Donna Noble from Series 4, and so you had all of those things. Obviously you have David Tennant returning as well, but you also have a real clear direction in which it's going to move into. Obviously, Unit is a perfect example of that. Unit has progressed with countless doctors and throughout many, many years of the show. And it's been set up in a way now where it could move forward with a new doctor or without a doctor entirely and still feel inherently Doctor Who, as did the Sarah Jane Adventures or Torchwood. And also, the introduction of Ncuti Gatwa as 15, not coming right at the end of the episode, and actually getting a chance to see him in action and also have a kind of passing of the baton from David Tennant to Ncuti Gatwa. I think a big thing that happened when David Tennant left and Matt Smith came in is it was very much your typical, he's gone, he's here. But because David Tennant was so popular, people instantly didn't like Matt Smith and didn't give him a chance. And so here, because they were interacting with each other, it almost felt like them going, he's okay with it, so you can be too. Look, they're friends. It's okay. And I don't necessarily think that's, what their thought process was, but it does feel a little bit like that, where they are giving the audience a moment to go, this is okay, this is fine. And yeah, the balance was really good with the continuity between what had come before and where we're moving in the future. Speaking of, Ncuti Gatwa. Up. Ncuti Gatwa is the Doctor. I cannot wait to see Ncuti Gatwa take hold of that role and make it his own. I'm so excited. There's not much that needs to be said, really. He was brilliant. I mean, also, credit to him, because his first day on the job, he stood there in front of a lot of people in his pants. I mean, bless him. I mean, he's wonderful. I think he's going to really do wonders to the role. And because of the bi-generation, which personally, I know it's divisive, taken up for the bi-generation, I think that they've done a really interesting thing. I'll be honest. At first, I was confused. I couldn't get my head around it, wasn't sure. But now that I've really looked into it, if you need a little bit more help understanding it, we have got a video out explaining that ending and what bi-generation really means. I think it's a really interesting way of going forward with the show. And as I said, Ncuti Gatwa is full of so much joy and energy. And because of the way the Doctor was heading, with all of those burdens and that guilt and the struggles that the Doctor was facing, I think the fact that they've done the bi-generation and freed this new Doctor from those burdens, I think it's a really clever way of doing that and also being able to then move forward with the show without having to acknowledge or incorporate those traumas into the show going forward. I think it's a really clever way of being able to have a relaunch into a more upbeat rhythm of the show without completely disregarding everything that came before. I think it's very clever, and I also think that by introducing it and the things that Russell T Davies has said, it opens the door for more cameo appearances from past Doctors and other characters who might not have been able to return without some very complicated explanation before and now can. So overall, I think it was very clever. It just needed a little bit of time in my head to process and for me to really understand it, for me to be fully on board with it. So I would say give it a chance because it could open some very, very interesting doors for the show going forward. Another up across all of these episodes is the setup for future stories. It feels very much like Russell T Davies's first era as showrunner. There are plenty of things that are teased in these episodes that we don't have answers to yet and that seem like passing comments at the time, but having seen Russell's first run, we know they're not going to be left unaddressed. For example, just in the Giggle, we had the mention of Triad, which everyone seemed to know what it was, much like the Atmos situation that we saw in Series 3. Series 4. Obviously, we also had the Master's Tooth being picked up. I do not think for a second that that's going to be unresolved. We had the mention of, the Meep mentioned the boss. We had the Toymaker talking about his legions arriving. There are lots of comments that have been made that are dropping hints at things that are going to happen in the future. And knowing Russell T Davies, I don't think any of those things were mentioned unintentionally, and that is something that I think he's very good at doing, is mentioning things in passing that to some people mean nothing, and suddenly everything will slot into place and we'll go, oh, that's been in a thread since all the way back in the Star Beast, and I didn't even realise. And that's something that's very, very clever. So in general, there is one thing that unfortunately does come as a down across all the specials, is that for an anniversary special, I'm not quite sure it hit the mark in terms of what we come to expect from an anniversary special. And I know that, again, is maybe something to do with what our expectations are versus what they've actually done. They felt more like a celebration of Series 4 as opposed to a celebration of the last 60 years of Doctor Who. And while they were all great episodes, it felt a little bit more like here's just a new series as opposed to here's a celebratory series. With the exception of the Giggle, where I feel like they started to move slightly more in the right direction with the arrival of old companions such as Mel and a familiar villain from the show's history in the Toymaker. They're the kind of things we come to expect in an anniversary special. And I think, yes, the Giggle did start to approach that. And it did become a multi-Doctor story, even if it was a kind of unconventional way of doing it. But overall, to be advertised as 3 anniversary specials, they didn't quite hit the mark with regards to being an anniversary episode. Having said that, and up here, and I know that some people, I mean, even I forgot for a second that this was part of the 60th anniversary celebrations, Tales of the TARDIS was a really good addition. It made newer viewers, younger viewers aware of Classic Who. It encouraged them to watch Classic Who. And it also gave us new footage of some of those lovable past companions, doctors. It was just really beautiful to see. I particularly liked the interaction between Jo and Clyde, because for me, they're characters I'm familiar with because of the Sarah Jane Adventures. So even though I'm not 100% familiar with some of those older characters, there was still one in there that I could relate to, and I think they did a really good job of doing that. In hindsight, we have spoken about how they probably added that because even they maybe noticed that the 60th specials themselves weren't quite hitting the anniversary-ness of it, and so this was introduced as well. But I do like that they made Tales of the TARDIS, and I think it just added that little something that felt more like a celebration of all of Doctor Who, not just a specific series of it. And on that note, another thing that I'm really, really glad they've reintroduced and brought back in a way, Unleashed. Up for Unleashed. I loved sitting down and watching Doctor Who Confidential after over on BBC Three after the episode, and I was very sad when it stopped. I'm so glad to have Unleashed back. It really is an eye-opener to how they make the show. Like I said, I didn't know that Meep was so practically made until I watched Unleashed. And I know some people have maybe criticised or aren't so keen on the structure that they've kind of gone with it now and having Stefan Powell as the host. Personally, I like the addition of having the host there. It makes the interactions in the interviews seem a little bit more informal, a little bit more fun, as opposed to someone just sitting there and talking to a camera. There's more interaction between them. You get to kind of see him having a go at some of the jobs that and roles on set, which I think is more fun than just having someone talk to you about the role. Let's see someone who has no experience in that having a go at it and see if it's something that you might want to do. And last but not least, technically not the 60th, but we can't not talk about it. Let's just have a bonus up here for the Christmas trailer and, most importantly, the Goblin song. The Goblin song is very dark, and yet I can't get it out of my head and I cannot stop listening to it. I'm so excited to see what this Christmas episode is going to be like. We've not seen too much, the trailers are quite short and there's only a few clips here and there, but from what I've seen so far, from what we've seen of Ncuti Gatwa in the role already in the Giggle, I am very hopeful and very excited for Christmas Day. And let's not forget that Doctor Who is coming back for Christmas Day after so many years. And it's really going to be a time to celebrate, and I can't wait. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have done so many breakdowns, discussions and reviews of these episodes over the last 3 weeks, so make sure that you do look back over the channel and watch any of those that you might have missed. In the meantime, I've been Ellie with WhoCulture, and in the words of River Song herself, goodbye, sweeties.